When Richard Coleman knocked on apartment 4B to collect late rent, he never expected to find a 10-year-old girl with bloodied fingers hunched over a sewing machine. What she possessed would shatter his family's empire and unearth buried secrets that would shake America's elite to their core. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another unbreakable tale that will change how you see the world. Richard Coleman wasn't used to collecting rent personally. That was a job for property managers, people paid to handle the messy business of tenant relations, while he reviewed spreadsheets from the comfort of his corner office. But today was different. The Rodriguez brothers, who usually handled his East Side properties, were both out with COVID, and there was that one unit, 4B, 3 weeks behind on payment with no response to emails or calls. So here he was, knocking on a scratched apartment door in a building he owned but had never actually visited, his Italian leather shoes out of place on the worn hallway carpet. The door creaked open just enough to reveal a slice of dimly lit apartment in the face of a young black girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old. What struck Richard wasn't her age, though finding a child alone was concerning enough, but her eyes. They held a weariness no child should possess, a quiet dignity that seemed to evaluate him without fear. "Can I help you?" Her voice was soft, but steady, lacking the nervousness most children would show when confronting a stranger. Richard cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable in his $3,000 suit. "I'm looking for Elaine Williams. I'm the property owner." The girl's expression didn't change. "My mother is sleeping." She glanced over her shoulder toward what must have been a bedroom. "She's been sick." Without invitation, she stepped back, opening the door wider. Richard hesitated, then stepped inside. The apartment was small, clean, but worn. What caught his attention immediately was the old sewing machine set up near the window, surrounded by neatly stacked fabrics in various patterns. Beside it sat the girl's small stool, threads and scissors arranged with surprising precision. "I'm here about the rent," Richard said, adjusting his tie. "You're 3 weeks late now." The girl nodded as though this was expected news. "I know." She walked to a wooden box on the counter and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "It's only half," she explained, handing it to him. "The rest will come when I finish these dresses. Mrs. Patterson pays well and always sends more customers." Richard took the envelope, absently counting the worn bills while trying to process what he was seeing. A violent coughing fit from the bedroom shattered the silence. "My mother has pneumonia," the girl explained, returning to her stool and picking up a half-finished dress. "I have to finish 3 more of these by tomorrow." Richard noticed her fingers then, small, calloused, with makeshift bandages covering what must have been countless needle pricks. He looked from her hands to the pile of meticulously sewn dresses, some with intricate beadwork that would challenge professional seamstresses. "What's your name?" he finally asked. "Zoe," she replied, threading her needle without looking up. Zoe Williams. Something about her matter-of-fact acceptance of her situation, a child supporting her sick mother, negotiating with a landlord, working through the night, made Richard deeply uncomfortable. He had grown up in mansions, attended elite private schools, inherited a real estate empire worth millions. Their lives were parallel universes that should never have crossed paths. "I'll come back next week for the rest," he said, pocketing the envelope. Zoe just nodded, her focus already returned to her sewing. 2 days later, an unexpected call interrupted Richard's investor meeting. "Mr. Coleman, this is Mercy Hospital. We're calling about a patient, Elaine Williams. You were listed as her emergency contact by her daughter." Richard didn't remember giving Zoe his number, but something about the Williams surname made him excuse himself from the conference room immediately. At the hospital reception desk, he found Zoe sitting alone, the same expression of quiet dignity, but now with red-rimmed eyes from crying in secret. "They won't let me see her," Zoe said without introduction. "They say I'm too young to be alone in the room and that I need a responsible adult. I gave them your number because you own our house." The simplicity of that childish logic hit him hard. To Zoe, the landlord was the closest figure of authority she could call on in an emergency. What did that say about this girl's life? While they waited, Richard learned more. Elaine Williams was a seamstress who had been working from home since her illness worsened. Zoe had learned to sew by watching her mother, and now took on the jobs she couldn't complete. At 11 years old, she managed payments, negotiated deadlines, and took care of the house by herself. Dr. Carson finally approached them. Mrs. Williams has pneumonia complicated by tuberculosis. She needs extended hospitalization, at least 3 weeks, then home care. In the privacy of the hallway, Zoe finally broke down. "They're going to take me away," she whispered, her composure cracking. "Who?" Richard asked. "Social services. If my mother stays here more than 3 days, they'll find out I'm alone." She swallowed hard. "It's happened before. They almost put me in a shelter." Just then, a middle-aged black woman with a social worker's badge approached. "Zoe Williams? I'm Diana Morris from Child Protective Services. We need to talk about your temporary arrangements." Panic flashed across Zoe's face. Richard realized she was about to run away. "She's under my supervision," he said, surprising himself. "I'm Richard Coleman, the owner of the property where they live. I'm taking care of her temporarily at her mother's request." Diana looked at him skeptically. "Do you have any documentation to prove that?" "I can arrange that. I have a lawyer who can prepare everything today." Over the next few days, Richard plunged into a world that was entirely foreign to him. His lawyer, Martin Goldstein, thought he was crazy. "Richard, you have no experience with children. Social services will never approve it." "Then get them to approve it," he replied dryly. "This girl is not going to a shelter." While the legal proceedings were underway, Richard took Zoe to his luxurious penthouse. The girl walked as if she were afraid of breaking something just by looking at it. "You can choose any room you like," he said. "I'd rather stay close to my mother," she replied softly. "I can sleep at the hospital." "That's not allowed, Zoe, and you need to rest." "I have work to do. Mrs. Patterson paid me in advance." Richard looked at her small, calloused hands. "We don't need that money right now." "I do," she replied intensely. "It's my responsibility." The next day, they met with a social worker in Martin's office. "Mr. Coleman, it's unusual for a single man with no family ties to request custody of a girl," Diana said. "I'm just helping a tenant. The alternative is a system that will separate her from her mother." Diana looked at Zoe, who remained silent but alert. "What do you think, Zoe? Would you rather stay with Mr. Coleman or go to a foster home?" "Mr. Coleman lets me work," she replied sincerely. "In foster homes they don't, and if I don't work, we lose our apartment." On the way out, Diana pulled Richard aside. "I'm watching you, Mr. Coleman. If I find anything suspicious, I'll take immediate action." What no one noticed was Victoria Reynolds watching them from her parked car. Victoria, the director of the board at Coleman Estates, was known for her uncompromising nature. When Richard joined the board a few years earlier, she had seen him as a threat to her control. Now, discreetly photographing the scene, she smiled. Meanwhile, in the days that followed, Richard discovered something intriguing in the building documents. "Your rent hasn't gone up in 5 years, he remarked. "All the other properties in the area have been adjusted." "My mother said she had an arrangement with the previous owner," Zoe explained. "She mended his clothes for free." "And now you're taking her place," Richard stated, connecting the dots. At the Coleman Estates office, Victoria presented her discovery to select board members. "Richard is harboring a black child with no proven relatives," she said, displaying the photos. "The press would have a field day with this." "What are you suggesting?" asked one of the members, uncomfortable. "I suggest that Richard is demonstrating emotional instability, putting the company's reputation at risk," she replied coldly. "And I propose that we consider actions to protect our interests." What Victoria didn't know was that while she was planning to use Zoe against Richard, the girl was already weaving her own safety net. Between sewing stitches and hospital visits, she watched, listened, and stored every piece of information from Richard's phone conversations to documents he absent-mindedly left on the table. In her school notebook, between math lessons, A meticulous record grew, and somewhere in that tangle of invisible threads was the truth about why, of all the apartments in the city, her mother had insisted on that particular building belonging to the Colemans. A truth that would forever change the balance of power in that elite family. A week had passed when Richard received the unexpected phone call. Victoria Reynolds requested his immediate presence at Coleman Estates headquarters for an extraordinary board meeting. The icy tone of his secretary suggested that it was not a friendly summons. "They're going to try to get you out," warned Martin when Richard consulted him. "Victoria has been digging up information about you and the girl. My sources say she's going to use it to question your mental capacity." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Elaine Williams's condition had stabilized, but she remained semi-conscious, unable to answer the questions that were piling up. At Richard's apartment, Zoe worked furiously at her sewing machine. But it wasn't dresses she was producing. It was pieces of a much larger puzzle. "Are you really going to face them?" Zoe asked, looking up from her work as Richard prepared for the meeting. "I have to go, it's my company too." "Then take this." She handed him her school notebook. "Page 27. Richard opened the notebook and froze. There, meticulously organized, were old newspaper clippings, copies of documents, and precise notes with dates and names. In the center of the page, a yellowed clipping showed a photo of his own father, William Coleman, standing next to a group of workers. Among them was a young Elaine Williams. "Where did you get this?" "My mother kept it in a box. She worked in the first Coleman Estates building, sewing uniforms for the employees. Your father promised everyone a share of the profits, but then—" Zoe left the sentence unfinished, her intense gaze saying the rest. Richard vaguely remembered an old controversy, something his father had buried under layers of confidentiality agreements. Dozens of employees from the company's early days, mostly black, had been laid off without the compensation promised when the company took off. "There's more," Zoe continued, turning the page. Victoria was the legal director at the time. She was the one who drew up the bogus contracts so no one could complain. When Richard entered the glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor, the 9 board members were already seated. Victoria, impeccable in her gray pantsuit, smiled with the confidence of someone who holds all the cards. "Gentlemen," she began, "I have called this meeting because a serious problem compromises the image of Coleman Estates." She projected onto the screen the photos of Richard with Zoe leaving social services. Richard Coleman illegally harbored a black minor with no family connection, putting our company at risk of scandal. Murmurs rippled around the table. Victoria continued, her voice dripping with false concern. "I propose a temporary leave of absence while we evaluate his leadership abilities." Richard remained silent as the board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. When Victoria finished, he simply opened his laptop and connected it to the projector. "Before you vote, I would like to present some documents that have just come to my attention." The original contract signed by his father appeared on the screen, promising stock options to the company's first 50 employees, with Elaine Williams's signature clearly visible. Next was the altered document that had replaced the original, with Victoria's signature authorizing the change. These documents show how Victoria Reynolds personally orchestrated the fraud that robbed dozens of black families of their rightful shares in our company. Richard turned to Victoria, whose face had turned pale. "Shares that, with compound interest, would be worth approximately $25 million today." Victoria stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Documents forged by a child." "These are the originals from my father's files," Richard interrupted, "which I discovered thanks to Zoe Williams, the daughter of one of the people you helped defraud." Shock rippled through the room. One of the senior advisors took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Mr. Peterson," Richard asked, "you remember that time, don't you? You worked with my father when it all happened." The man nodded slowly. "I remember the rumors, but William assured us that everyone had been properly compensated." "A lie perpetuated by Victoria," Richard replied, then projected emails saved by his father. Conversations between Victoria and William Coleman discussing how to cover up the fraud they had committed against black employees. Victoria reached for her cell phone, but Martin, who had quietly entered the room, intervened. "Don't worry, Mrs. Reynolds. We've already sent copies of these documents to the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and major news outlets. I suggest you save your calls for your criminal lawyer." For the first time, Victoria Reynolds, the woman who had built her career on the backs of people like Elaine Williams, looked vulnerable. Her empire of lies was crumbling as her advisors demanded her immediate resignation. The next day, the newspapers ran headlines: "Scandal at Coleman Estates, decades of racial discrimination exposed." The company's stock plummeted 30% in the first hours of trading, while Victoria faced federal investigations. Richard returned to the hospital, where Elaine Williams had awakened. At her bedside, Zoe smiled for the first time since he had met her. "My mother always said that the truth finds its way," the girl said, holding Elaine's frail hand. "Even if it takes a generation." What no one could have imagined was that this was only the beginning of an even greater transformation. As Elaine lay in her hospital bed, looking at Richard and her daughter side by side, an even deeper secret hung between them. One that would redefine not only the company, but the very identity of everyone involved. 3 months after the scandal, the Coleman name came to represent something completely different in Boston. The Coleman Estates headquarters had been transformed, with a new sign at the entrance: Coleman and Williams Holdings, a change that symbolized more than just a business partnership. Richard had done the unthinkable. After confirming through DNA testing what his heart already knew, he announced it officially at a press conference. Zoe Williams was his biological daughter. "My family's history has been built on the systematic theft of black people's labor and dignity," he declared, with Zoe and a still recovering Elaine at his side. "I can't change the past, but I can rewrite the future." The Coleman Reparation Fund, established with 40% of the company's shares, began the process of compensating former employees and their families. For the 23 who had already passed away, including some with no known heirs, the money was directed to scholarships for young black people in disadvantaged communities. In the new boardroom, where once only white men decided the fate of properties in predominantly black neighborhoods, representatives from the communities themselves now sat with real decision-making power over investments and development. Victoria Reynolds, on the other hand, faced multiple federal charges. Her empire of lies, built over decades, collapsed in a matter of weeks. The evidence was irrefutable. Between testimony from former employees and internal documents, the Justice Department built a devastating case. It was the girl, Victoria, muttered in private conversations with her lawyers. How did a child discover what corporate lawyers hid for decades? The answer was simpler than she imagined. Elaine Williams had been much more than a seamstress. As an assistant secretary in the company's early years, she had access to documents that other employees would never see. Sensing the fraud being orchestrated, she began to keep copies. For years, she kept this evidence hidden, waiting for the right moment. "I knew that one day Richard would come back into our lives," Elaine explained to Zoe as she recovered at home. "Not for me, but for you. So I kept everything that could prove who he really was, the good and the bad." In the former sewing room, now converted into a study for Zoe, father and daughter had long and sometimes uncomfortable conversations about privilege, about race, about a system that allowed a black child to work in conditions no white child would ever be allowed to endure. "The real shame isn't that you showed up to collect the rent," Zoe said one afternoon as she showed Richard her new school project. "It's that you never noticed before. The Points That Connect project transformed the old building where they'd lived into an arts and crafts school, with an emphasis on sewing, design, and entrepreneurship for young people from marginalized communities. The first class, made up of 30 girls, was mentored by Zoe, who at 12 was already teaching techniques that many professionals didn't know. 6 months after the collapse of the old Coleman Estates, Victoria Reynolds was sentenced to 9 years in prison for fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. On the same day, The new company's urban redevelopment project was approved by the city council, a plan that would renovate neighborhoods without displacing original residents, with contractual guarantees of accessibility for low-income families. People take a lifetime to learn what I learned in 6 months, Richard reflected during an interview. That wealth without purpose is just empty accumulation. That privilege without responsibility is a form of silent violence. In the family's new home, Elaine was finally regaining her strength. The hands that had worked tirelessly for years now directed a team of seamstresses creating a line of school uniforms that would be donated to public schools in the area. One fall afternoon, as Zoe adjusted a new dress for her mother, Richard entered the room with an old box. "I found this in my father's files," he said, opening it carefully. Inside were dozens of drawings of uniforms and corporate clothing, all signed by Elaine Williams, dated 20 years ago. Drawings that the company had used without ever crediting or compensating her properly. "He knew all along that you were the real creator," Richard said, his voice breaking. "And yet he allowed Victoria to carry out that plan." Elaine picked up one of the sketches, running her fingers over the yellowed paper. "I never drew for money or recognition. I drew because it was what I loved to do." "That's why your designs were so good," Zoe replied proudly. "That's why mine are too." That night, as the city slept, 3 generations united by blood, separated by privilege, and finally reconnected by justice, planned a future where merit and opportunity would not be determined by the color of one's skin or the zip code of one's birth. Man who discovered that his true inheritance was not in the real estate he owned, but in the daughter he almost didn't know. A woman whose talent was stolen but whose dignity remained intact. And a girl who, with a needle and thread, sewed not just dresses but a bridge between worlds that seemed irreconcilable. While thousands of children like Zoe continue to face invisible barriers every day, stories like this remind us that real change begins when those in power choose to see beyond their own privilege. When they recognize that a true legacy isn't measured by bank accounts, but by the lives transformed along the way. Unbreakable tales are all around us. Sometimes they're hidden behind apartment doors, or in the quiet dignity of a child doing what should be impossible. Remember to subscribe for more stories of courage that challenge our understanding of what makes us truly unbreakable.